Yes, Arushi.
All right, thank you. Um, okay, so hi everyone. For today's SNA session, Dale and I would be introducing the concept of the informal economy and its treatment in the system of national accounts. The first part of today's presentation will focus primarily on the characteristics of the informal economy, its definition, and how the terms used to describe the informal economy have slightly different implications in this context versus the context of SNA. In the second part, Dale would continue the session to discuss the process of extracting the relevant data and approaches to measuring activities undertaken in the informal economy. So let's begin. It's well known that no economy is completely regulated and captured perfectly by statistical inquiries. Therefore, there have to be additional steps undertaken to attempt to cover unregulated activity, which means that it must be ensured that all activities, including those that may be described as hidden or underground, are encompassed in measures of total activity. And additionally, statisticians must also define what is meant by the subset of economic units that can be considered informal and how we can measure the same. By measuring the informal economy, we mean being able to measure that part of the economy that reflects the efforts of people without formal jobs to engage in some form of monetary economic activity. This is especially important in developing countries, and it is by estimating the size of the informal sector that it becomes somewhat possible to assess how far the benefits of social and development policies reach the impoverished, for example, people living in the streets or in the shanty towns. A lot of media attention is paid to the possibility of missing economic activities, and reports often suggest that the GDP figures published by National Statistical Offices often exclude large parts of the economy. A major part of the problem is that many assessment methods frequently fail to define what is to be measured when we talk about informal. And this lack of precision regarding the measurement target is worsened by the wide range of different terms in common use, such as hidden economy, shadow economy, illegal, informal, or the non-observed economy, just to name a few. There is no common understanding whether they all mean the same thing, and if not, what relationships do they have to one another. So it's important to clarify what we mean by these terms that are often used synonymously and how do these relate to each other. So the OECD Handbook on the Measurement of the Non-Observed Economy defines non-observed economy as economic activities that are missing from the basic data used to compile the national accounts because they are underground, illegal, household production for own final use, or informal. Including these activities in the national accounts is referred to as the measurement of the non-observed economy. Thus, the non-observed economy is like an umbrella term for these four activities. We can say that the measurement of non-observed economy also involves actions on two fronts. First, improvements in direct measurement by the data collection program, resulting in fewer non-observed activities and hence fewer non-measured activities. And secondly, improvement in indirect measurement during the compilation of the national accounts itself, resulting in fewer non-measured activities. So before we move on, let's play a quick game. If you can answer the question that what do you associate this picture with? Please type in your answers in the chat box now. Uh, I, I can't see the chat box, but the answer is, of course, the very popular TV show Breaking Bad. We are now going to see examples from the show to understand various types of non-observed economic activities. So first we have underground economic activities. The SNA framework recognizes that certain activities may be both productive in an economic sense and also quite legal, but deliberately concealed from public authorities in order to avoid the payment of income, value added, or other taxes or social security contributions, or to avoid having to meet certain legal standards such as minimum wages, maximum hours, safety, health standards, etc., and to avoid complying with certain administrative procedures such as statistical questionnaires, or administrative forms. These activities are known as underground activities. From the show Breaking Bad, we can take the example of Saul Goodman, who's a lawyer. He normally represents criminals and also engages in illegal activity himself, such as abetting money laundering or taking bribes. A lot of his income is associated with criminal activities, which he, of course, can't disclose. So, while practicing law in itself is both a productive and legal activity, such practice intertwined with lack of full disclosure of income, tax evasion, money laundering, etc., would render this an underground activity. It's also important to note that in the SNA framework, the borderline between underground and illegal production is not entirely clear. But the rule of thumb is that the rule of thumb that the framework follows is that underground activities are those not complying with administrative rules, such as maintaining full business accounts and filing tax returns, whereas illegal activities are those associated with criminal behavior. So this brings us to the second type of activity in the non-observed economy, that is illegal activities. I should mention here that Arvind has already presented last year a detailed presentation on illegal activities, including their concepts and statistical treatment. So just to recap, illegal activities are activities forbidden by law. For example, production and distribution of illegal drugs, or activities that are illegal when they are carried out by unauthorized actors, for example, unlicensed practice of medicine. Illegal production is thus classified by the SNA framework in two categories: the production of goods and services whose production, sale, or mere possession is forbidden by law, and production activities which are usually legal but become illegal when carried out by unauthorized producers. The third type of non-observed economic activities include production undertaken by household unincorporated enterprises exclusively for own final use by the owner's household. This is not a part of the informal sector according to the framework and is thus regarded as a separate aspect of the non-observed economy. It includes production of crops and livestock, production of other goods for their own final use, and construction of own houses and other own account fixed capital formation, imputed rents of owner occupiers, and services of paid domestic servants. Obviously, some household production activities are on a very small scale. Thus, in the SNA framework, the criteria followed is that only if the amount produced is believed to be quantitatively important in relation to the total supply of that good in the country, it should be estimated. Again, taking the example from Breaking Bad, if you recall that Hank, a character on the show, starts his own small brewery in his home garage and calls it Trader Brow. Um, since this beer is produced for own consumption within the household and by the owner of the household, it is not sold or bartered and is also produced on a very small scale. It would fall under the category of household production for own final use. About the informal sector itself, which is the main focus of this presentation. The informal sector represents an important part of the economy and the labor market in many countries, especially the developing countries. The international definition of the informal sector was adopted in 1993 by the 15th International Conference of Labor Statisticians Resolution concerning statistics of employment in the informal sector, published by the International Labour Organization. And this definition was also included in the SNA framework. The definition states that the informal sector may be broadly categorized as consisting of units engaged in the production of goods or services with the primary objective of generating employment and incomes to the persons concerned. These units typically operate at a low level of organization with little or no division between labor and capital, as factors of production are on a small scale. Labor relations, where they exist, are based mostly on casual employment, kinship, or personal and social relations rather than contractual agreements with formal guarantees. Most informal sector activities provide goods and services whose production and distribution are perfectly legal. This is the characteristic that mainly distinguishes them from illegal production. There is also a distinction between informal sector and underground activities, although that may be more blurred. informal sector activities are not necessarily performed with the deliberate intention of evading the payment of taxes or social security contributions. However, there can be some overlap as some informal sector enterprises may prefer to remain unregistered or unlicensed simply in order to avoid compliance with regulations and thereby reduce production costs. Another aspect to consider is that the production units of the informal sector have the characteristic features of household enterprises. We will discuss these concepts in more detail in the upcoming slides. And if we look at the extent of informality within various countries, we can notice the extremely high rates in the global south, which is also a part of the developing world. Countries like India, Bangladesh, Congo, Chad, Bolivia are to name few, which have extremely high rates of informality, as you can see from the figures given here. So now that we have established that while the non-observed economy overlaps with the informal sector, the two are not the same. Consequently, measures of the non-observed economy will overlap with activities undertaken informally, but not exactly match them. While the non-observed economy and the informal sector overlap, neither is a complete subset of the other. Hence, the green circle here represents some activities that are not observed but are undertaken informally, and the blue circle represents the activities that are undertaken informally but are observed. Um, the overlap consists of activities that are not observed and undertaken informally. The relative size of the three segments will vary from country to country. Let's consider some examples. A vehicle repair shop with, let's say, 5 or 10 employees may be formal but too small to be covered by statistical inquiries and therefore not observed. Street traders or taxi drivers may be both not observed and informal, thus falling in the overlap portion of the Venn diagram. Teaching assistants may be informal but observed. The situation is complicated by the fact that all these people, such as street traders, taxi drivers, vehicle repair shops, and teaching assistants, they may be formal in some countries and informal in others, just as they may be observed in some countries and not observed in others. It should be noted that all countries have both non-observed parts of their economies and informal enterprises, though the scale of each and the policy interest in identifying the informal sector may vary. There is no single criteria that is sufficient on its own to determine what is meant by informal, as different governments and organizations place more emphasis on some criteria and some on others. Therefore, several criteria must be considered. So two questions must be kept in mind when considering each possible criteria. The first question is is the criteria that is being considered really central to the definition of activity undertaken by a unit considered to be an informal enterprise? And the second question is that is the criteria in question the basis for reaching a definition that will yield internationally comparable results? In order to formulate a precise delineation of what is the subject of interest, a number of potential characteristics can be listed for the word informal. So let's look at the characteristics of this term one by one. One interpretation of what is informal is whatever is not registered with some arm of the government. However, the problem with this criteria are obvious. Different countries have different practices on registration. Some may insist that all activities, however small and casual, should be registered. Others may be more pragmatic and require activities to be registered only when their turnover exceeds a given amount or when the number of employees exceeds a given number. Further, whatever the official requirements for registration may be, the degree of compliance with these requirements will vary according to the extent to which they are enforced in practice. Therefore, a definition of the informal sector based on registration solely is not going to give international comparability or possibly comparability within the country itself over time. The second characteristic and closely related to the characteristic of registration is legal incorporation. To clarify, incorporation is the legal process used to form a corporate entity or a company. which means that a corporation is the resulting legal entity that separates the firm's assets and income from its owners and investors. In SNA, all legally incorporated enterprises are treated as falling into one of the corporation sectors, but these sectors also include quasi corporations. A quasi corporation is defined in SNA as a unit where either a full set of accounts, including the balance sheet, is available or can be drawn up. In this way, some units that the owners choose not to incorporate are treated as if they are incorporated if they have a full set of accounts, and some units may have very detailed information about their production activities but not about other accounts. Thus, they cannot be treated as quasi corporations and are excluded from the household sector despite appearing to be formal in terms of the nature of their activity. Examples where this may happen include doctors, lawyers, engineering consultants, and many other professionals. In addition to the statistical restriction on treating production activities as if they are undertaken by incorporated units, laws requiring or permitting incorporation vary from country to country, thus limiting international comparability again. As there is considerable variation of statistical and administrative practices, one possibility for identifying informal enterprises might be to rely simply on the size of the enterprises, which could be defined either in terms of turnover or number of employees. However, the problem with this turnover, with the concept of turnover again, is that there is potential variability across countries and also over time. On the other hand, there are also problems with using the maximum number of employees as a criteria. On one hand, using maximum number of employees to identify informal enterprises would result in some units with full accounts, which are thus allocated to the corporation sector, being identified as informal if the number of employees is less than the maximum number of employees. On the other hand, some units in the household sector with a full set of accounts would be regarded as formal, but the number of employees is greater than the maximum number of employees, thereby leading them to be characterized as formal. The next characteristic is the terms of employment. Some employees have terms of employment that entitle them to various benefits in addition to their wages and salaries. These benefits typically include paid annual and sick leave and pension entitlement. However, there could also be production units that offer such terms to some of their workers, but also employ people on less generous grounds, thereby offering no benefits beyond wages and salaries. Self-employed people may also draw up terms of employment to provide some supplementary income, and they may often work under terms that don't offer employment as such, but act as a service contract. Next, we have the coverage under statistical surveys. The coverage of statistical surveys, particularly establishment surveys, varies considerably from country to country and also from industry to industry within a country. Often, small scale enterprises are excluded because the statistical office considers the cost of collecting information from such units to be too expensive, considering the proportion of output they account for and the potential for inaccuracies in the reported data. However, there may be a grossing up procedure to allow for the non-coverage of the smaller units, wherein the production activities of these units are likely to appear attributed to the corporation sector, even though strict conformity with SNA guidelines would place these in the household sector. The next characteristic is location. Some analysts may be interested mainly in the development of informal enterprises in urban areas, particularly in so-called shanty towns or small settlements out in the outskirts of large conurbations. However, the role of the informal economy is important in both main city area as well as outside the main urban areas, especially for international comparability and for comparison over time when internal migration between urban and rural areas is significant. Therefore, restricting coverage by location is also undesirable. Now, after understanding these characteristics, let's revisit the definition of the informal sector as given by the ILO. According to the ILO, the informal sector may be broadly categorized as consisting of units engaged in the production of goods and services with the primary objective of generating employment and incomes to the persons concerned. These units typically operate at a low level of organization with little or no division between labor and capital as factors of production and on a small scale. Production units of the informal sector have the characteristic features of household enterprises. The fixed and other assets used do not belong to the production units as such, but to their owners. Let's look at the second part of that. Let's look at the second part of that definition in a little more detail, since it's crucial to the concept of the informal sector. The major focus of ILO is to present the concept of an informal sector as a subset of household unincorporated enterprises. In SNA, household enterprises do not constitute separate legal entities independently of the household members who own them, which means that the fixed and other assets used do not belong to the production units as such, but actually to their owners. The units as such cannot engage in transactions or enter into contracts with other units, nor incur liabilities on their own behalf. The owners have to raise the necessary finance at their own risk and are personally liable for any debts or obligations incurred in the production process. Expenditure for production is often indistinguishable from household expenditure. For instance, consider a small baking business being run from a house and by the members of the household themselves. In this case, the use of tools for production such as bowls, plates, whisks, oven, etc., are often found within the household itself. Hence, these are assets that do not really belong to the business as such, but to the owners or the people within the household that are running the business. Therefore, the ILO concept of the informal sector takes household unincorporated enterprises and further subdivides them into three: one part forming the informal sector, a second part being units treated as formal because of the number of employees or registration criteria, and the third part being referred to simply as households. The subset of household enterprises being treated as belonging to the informal sector have economic objectives, behavior, and form a form of organization that sets them apart from other unincorporated enterprises. Specifically, the informal sector is defined according to the types of production the enterprise undertakes, still maintaining the production boundary of the SNA and not extending it to include own use household services. And the other two aspects are excluded from the definition of informal as per the ILO. Let's also look at the parts that we are excluding from the concept of informal activities. First, exclusion of units with formal characteristics. Recall that the coverage of the informal sector is restricted by using the criteria of number of employees or registration. The minimum number of employees chosen is left to the country to decide based on national circumstances. Therefore, only those not registered under specific forms of legislation, national legislation, should be treated as informal. Then we're also excluding units producing purely for own final use. The ILO imposes the restriction on the concept of informal, stating that at least some of the production must be sold or bartered. Thus, some household enterprises that the SNA treats as producing for own final use, as most of their production is for final use, are included, but those that produce exclusively for own final use are excluded, which means that the activities of dwelling services produced for owner occupation would be excluded from the informal sector. Further, the ILO concept of the informal sector is always a subset of household unincorporated enterprises operating within the production boundary of the SNA. The SNA production boundary describes the range of productive economic activities that should be included in GDP estimates and is thus is therefore the boundary relevant to considerations of exhaustiveness. Activities included within the boundary include the production of all goods or services that are supplied to units other than their producers or intended to be supplied, the own account production of goods that are retained by their producers for their own final consumption or gross capital formation, and own account production of housing services by owner occupiers. Now let's also look at the term household unincorporated enterprises as given by ILO. These units are divided into the following two subsets: unincorporated enterprises without employees, and the ILO term for such units is informal own account enterprises, and second, unincorporated enterprises with employees. The ILO term for such units is enterprises of informal employers. With these additional criteria, the production unit in the informal sector is defined as a household enterprise with at least some production for sale or barter, for which one or more of the criteria of a limited size of employment, non-registration of enterprises, and non-registration of the enterprise or of its employees are met. Apart from defining the informal sector, the ILO also recommended that some additional considerations about the scope of the informal sector and statistical treatment must also be met. First, in principle, all goods and services producing activities are within the scope. These might be presented according to the alternative aggregation that takes into account the fact that some economic activities, such as public administration and defense, are undertaken by units in general government and therefore cannot qualify as informal sector activities. ILO also recommends that agricultural activities are measured separately from other economic activities to ensure international comparability and to data collection tools and sample design. And the activities of households as employers of domestic personnel, with households being producers for own final use, are also outside the scope of the informal sector. Next, geographical coverage includes both urban and rural areas, even if preference may be initially given to informal enterprises operating in urban areas. And lastly, outworkers, that are people who work away from their employer's premises, are also to be included if the units for which they work are included in the informal sector. Some of the terminologies used in the conventional SNA framework have different implications than those used by the ILO in its International Conference of Labor Statisticians Resolution, or the ICLS. First, let's look at the term sector. The term sector in the expression informal sector does not have the same basis as the usual use of the word sector throughout SNA. In SNA, sectors are made up of complete institutional units. However, in the context of informal sector, only the productive activities are concerned. Thus, for example, households having no productive activity are simply not considered in the steps to identify those unincorporated enterprises operated by households that are to be included in the informal sector. Next, we look at the term enterprise. In SNA, a corporation represents a single enterprise, but each such enterprise may consist of a number of establishments. A key difference between enterprise and establishment is that a full set of accounts must exist or could be constructed for an enterprise, but for an establishment, a much more restricted set of data is available. Typically, only information relating to production, number of employees, and capital formation associated with the activity is available. Now, the SNA usage of unincorporated enterprise is taken to mean the totality of all unincorporated activity undertaken by a household, even though in a supply and use table, for example, this may be partitioned by types of activity and grouped with establishments of corporations undertaking the same activity. The use of unincorporated enterprise in the ILO description of the informal sector does not correspond to the totality of unincorporated activity of a household, but to each activity separately. Further, the ILO identifies individual members of a household as owning each establishment or enterprise and is capable of employing workers. In the SNA, on the other hand, it is the household collectively that is responsible for all activity and for employing workers. Next, we consider the term subsectoring production. The SNA subdivides production into market production, production for own final use, and non-market production. Non-market production is not an issue here since it is never undertaken by households. However, to meet the ILO guidelines, it is necessary to subdivide production for own final use into those where some of the production is for sale or barter and those where production is exclusively for own final use. In the case of unincorporated enterprises where only some of the production is sold or bartered, all of the production of the units of all of the production of the unit of those goods and services is still included in production by the informal sector. So look at the terms formal sector, informal sector, and household sector together. The SNA does not use the expression formal sector, but usually all units in corporation sector, general government, and NPISH are perceived as being part of a formal sector as far as the production is concerned. Quasi-corporations are included because they are included in the corporation sector. However, in the ILO context, this is not the same as saying that any unit that is not informal is formal, since households with unincorporated enterprises not included in the formal sector are further divided between those that are treated as formal because of the size or registration, and the rest are not treated as informal but are simply left in a group called households. The ILO meaning of households is thus quite different from that of the SNA. Let's also understand this key difference through an illustration. As we know, the ILO concept only includes the subset of informal sector within the household unincorporated enterprises, and the other two are left out. The SNA, on the other hand, all the units includes all units included under ILO guidelines as informal, plus those units with unincorporated enterprises treated as formal, plus those unincorporated enterprises excluded because they produce exclusively for own final use, plus those households with no unincorporated enterprises, and lastly, institutional households as well. It has increasingly been realized that production alone is not the only aspect of the economy where a distinction between formal and informal is informative. It is also relevant for employment. The ILO defines formal wage employment as employment under terms that bring associated benefits such as paid leave and pension entitlement, and regards all other forms of employment, including self-employment, as informal. Further, it is possible for formal units to have informal employees, and it is also possible, although less unlikely, that units that are classified as informal may have terms of employment for some of their workers that make them formal employees. The ILO considers 5 categories of jobs. First, own account workers, or the self-employed workers in SNA terms, heads of unincorporated enterprises with employees who are treated as employers, unpaid family workers contributing labor to the unincorporated enterprise. Fourth is employees, and lastly, members of producers' cooperatives. Formal enterprises provide informal jobs only as employees or contributing family workers. Informal enterprises may offer any of the 5 types of informal as well as formal jobs. Households, in the ILO sense, provide informal jobs as own account workers, employees, and family workers. Some domestic staff may also have formal jobs. Besides informal employment in total, it is useful to identify the extent of employment in informal enterprises. This excludes informal jobs in formal units, excludes any informal jobs in other households and incorporated enterprises, and includes formal jobs in informal enterprises. Accordingly, the ILO defines the population employed in the informal sector as comprising all persons who, during a given reference period, were employed in at least one informal sector unit, irrespective of their status in employment and whether it was the main or the secondary job. The coverage of employment in the informal sector is thus indicated by the yellow border in this table. Brings us to the end of the first session, where we primarily focused on the characteristics, definition, and scope of the informal economy. We can now move on to the second part of the session today by Dale, where he will discuss data sources and methodologies for estimating the size of the informal sector in the economy. We can take any questions after Dale's presentation. Thank you, and over to you, Dale.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. So I will be covering three parts in this part of the presentation. So Arishi provided us a very good foundation in understanding the concepts behind the informal economy. So in this part, we will look out more for the approaches used in either deriving data in the SNA or directly measuring activities using data collection methods. So on to the outline. Um, First is to give a very brief background of the work of the Delhi Group, and then we'll discuss how the first attempts to standardize the informal sectors across countries and how the ILO manual came about. And the second topic is about deriving data on the activities of informal enterprises from the SNA accounts, so which covers the three-step process mainly. And then finally, the approaches to measure activities in the informal economy, which will cover surveys and the presentation of data. Right. So in this first part, we'll talk about the work of the Delhi Group. So what is the Delhi Group? The Delhi Group was formed in 1997. It is a special working group of experts that specifically tackle the topic of the informal sector. And their objective at the time was to identify internationally comparable data for the informal sector. So in 1999, the Delhi Group proposed a subset of the informal sector. And although at the present, this covers only a portion of the informal sector, um, it was a significant step at the time. So finally, this led to the ILO publishing a manual on the informal sector and on informal employment, which we saw referenced quite a lot in the first part, and as well as in the next few slides. So here are the subset of here are the criteria that they first set out to 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 do in 1999. So the first standard is to use the status of legal organization, that is to say, um, unincorporated enterprises. And second, according to the type of accounts that are incomplete. And third, by in terms of product destination, meaning that it had to have some amount of market output. And this last one in particular we'll see more in the ILO definition later on. So the second point here is that if an employment size criterion is used by the country, is preferred to be used by a country, then it is left to the country's discretion. I believe Arishi has also mentioned this earlier. But for reporting internationally, countries should provide figures separately for less than 5 employees in an attempt to be able to compare across countries. Right. So third, once again, if the country is using the employment size criterion, then it should provide disaggregated figures for registered and non-registered enterprises. And fourth, if using the criterion for non-registration, then it should provide disaggregated figures for enterprises less than five and enterprises with more than 5 employees. And then fifth, for countries that include agricultural activities, then it should include separate figures for agricultural and non-agricultural activities. And then sixth, the persons in professional or technical activities should be included if they meet the criteria, even if these persons do not come into mind when the informal sectors the informal sector is being talked about. And seventh, paid domestic services should be included as well, unless they are provided by employees of the household where services are rendered. And eighth, if covering both urban and rural areas, then it should include separate figures for urban and rural areas. And last is to include persons who are participating in other sectors who also have a secondary activity in the informal sector. Right. So moving on from that part, in the second part, we'll talk about deriving data on informal enterprises from the SNA accounts. So the SNA recommends a three-step process to try to identify activities undertaken by informal enterprises within the national accounts and within the SNA sectors. So the first box here is to identify those unincorporated enterprises within the whole of the SNA household sector that are to be candidates to be considered um, in the informal sector. And the second is to consider national practices in establishing the household sector to see whether or not if there are any adjustments necessary after doing step number one. And the third is to break the type of activity down so that any sort of exclusions according to the type of activity could be made in this step. So let's discuss each of the three steps one by one. So once again, the first step involves identifying which unincorporated enterprises within the household sector to include, or the other side of the coin is to exclude, right? So at the outset, we want to exclude household units such as prisons, religious orders, and retirement homes, as well as other households with no production activity. And we also want to exclude households whose only activity is the production of services from owner-occupied dwellings and the production of series by employing domestic staff or both. So generally here we want to include households with no production activity, those that do not include an unincorporated enterprise. And then after the exclusion that we do previously, what will remain are households that all contain some level of production activity, whether be it for the market or for its own final use. However, um, how the ILO defines a market producer is quite different from how the SNA defines it. So the ILO definition is that if there is any level of output sold, then it is a market producer. Whereas in contrast to the SNA definition, where for a unit to be a market producer, it has to have most or all of its output to be sold to the market for it to be considered a market producer. So as you can see, the SNA definition is sort of like a subset of the ILO definition, or rather the units um, that correspond to the SNA definition will be a subset of that of uh, the set of units that will be encapsulated by the ILO definition. So to deal with this sort of difference, the SNA recommends a three-way split where which goes like this. So the first category will contain the units where most or all output is sold. Second category will contain units where only some of its output is sold. And third will contain units with output exclusively for its own final use. Or in other words, output that is not sold to the market. Finally, um, the ILO also distinguishes here that uh, between households that do not have workers employed on a continuous basis and households that do not, or in other words, households that have self-employed workers. So here's a visualization of what I just discussed. So um, if we divide the remaining households into three, between all and most production sold, some production sold, and no production sold, then the SNA definition would only encapsulate the first one, while the ILO definition would encapsulate the sum of the first and the second one. But putting these two steps together, we see the treatment in a diagram here. So from the very top are the candidate households that after we made the common exclusions, if you recall the prisons and the religious orders and etc. In the second level, we distinguish households that are self-employed versus the ones who have employees. And at the third level, we distinguish households by their production activity, whether it be for market production or its own final use. And finally, the three-way split where we split units according to whether or not they sell most or all of their production, and whether they only sell some level of their production, and finally if they do not sell any production at all. So the SNA here will consider only the first category as a market producer, as you see here, while the ILO will consider the sum of the first two as a market producer, as represented by the shades of blue down here. Right. So this next step is to consider any national practices in establishing the household sectors to see if any adjustment to the first step we just did is necessary. And the best example of which would probably be the NPISH. So in countries where the NPISH is not separated from the household sector, then it should be removed at this step. And the next point here is that I guess this is just a reiteration of the definition of the informal sector, but production units that are not formally incorporated but do have complete accounts should not should be excluded from the household sector. So far this is a bird's eye view of what we have so far. We see that the NPISH here at the very right side is excluded, just as we mentioned. Whereas a portion of the households that we discussed are included, and so are corporations that are uh, unregistered or with fewer than a given number of employees. So depending on which that country prefers to use. Right. So the third step involves providing a breakdown by type of activity so that common exclusions according to the type of activity can be made. So for example, if we know for certain that a particular activity has no informal elements in it, then it would be easier to trim that portion away after this sort of disaggregation has been made. And since initially this separation will be in terms of units and not activities, then there will still be some services from owner-occupied dwellings that is included but should be removed. So the chapter goes on to say that further exclusions could be done for example, for paid domestic staff and for some agricultural production. And so the informal sector here only goes as far as the income accounts because the chapter claims that it is quite impossible to identify other income flows. So um, for example, consumption and capital formation here may only relate to the activity itself that is in question rather than rather than the household to which they actually belong to as a full um, institutional unit. So the informal sector is not strictly a sector in the SNA sense, and so figures cannot be presented in in the full set of accounts. Production, sorry, we would only see it in the income accounts. However, it is recommended that wherever possible, then two supplementary tables should be prepared, um, which means one on production or generation of income, and the other one covering employment. So we have the following elements for production. So we have production, intermediate consumption, value added, the compensation of employees, gross mixed income, consumption of fixed capital, and net mixed income. And then for employment, we have the following elements. Under employment in the informal sector, we have formal jobs and informal jobs. And for the informal employment outside the informal sector, we have employment in the formal sector and in other household unincorporated enterprises. So this last portion is a bit more straightforward. This deals with the data collection methods that cover the informal sectors, which covers the following surveys listed here. So, household surveys can be used to collect information on production by household enterprises that are not particularly covered by establishment surveys. So, wherever it is applicable, the labor force survey as well can be used to complement and sometimes even substitute for the household surveys. And the chapter also goes to point out that there might be a need for special questions to identify unpaid work in instances such as these. So such as small family enterprises, activities undertaken by women and children, activities undertaken away from home, and undeclared activities in the informal sector businesses conducted as secondary jobs. So without these special questions, these instances might go under the radar. So these are things that we have to keep in mind. So establishment surveys can be used to measure activity and undertaken by the informal sector as well. But there are a couple of things that we have to take into mind when doing so. So the first is to be mindful of the production units with no fixed location, and they should eventually be considered one way or the other. Um, and the second one is to be mindful of double counting that could happen if the data collection is done at different times as opposed to a simultaneous one. So last is the mixed household enterprise survey. So from the name itself, the mixed household enterprise surveys are supplementary modules attached to the labor force or household surveys. And so this kind of survey should cover all household entrepreneurs, including informal ones. And however, just a couple of things we need to look out for. So first, if the sample reflects the geographical distribution of the economic activities of the household production, and second, if there is duplication or once again double counting, if the household production is reported by both uh, by more than two owners or partners who may belong to different households. So as such, taking into account these approaches as well as these caveats would help in data collection in the informal sector. So, right, this is the final slide. I think this concludes our presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. So Arishi and I may now take questions if there are any at this point. Thank you. Right. So since there seems to be none, thank you very much for your attention and see you next week. Thank you.